Paris, 1 a.m. Investigators open a black box found at a crash site. Concorde, the most sophisticated passenger plane ever built, has crashed, killing everyone on board.
The loss of an icon like Concorde was a catastrophe beyond all imagination.
113 people died. The tape from the cockpit voice recorder is carefully analyzed, but many questions remain unanswered. A feverish hunt for evidence yields a sharp-edged piece of metal on the runway. The tragedy seems unavoidable. But independent investigators aren't convinced.
This looks like a cover-up, as if they were under orders not to talk.
In Britain and France, Concorde experts and journalists keep digging.
The crash was avoidable. If the other mistakes had not been made, this plane could, in all probability, have been landed safely.
On May 31, 2003, Air France retired its entire Concorde fleet. It was the fastest passenger plane in the world. Traveling at twice the speed of sound, Concorde became an icon of high-tech aviation. As the plane departed for its final flight from Paris to New York, thousands came to say farewell.
We used to hear it when we picked up our kids, and now we'll never hear it again. We can't chase it anymore, because that's what we did. We ran after it, every time.
I don't know what to do. There's nothing now. We used to visit her every morning or in the evening, and now there's nothing anymore.
Although Concorde featured some of the most advanced technology in commercial aviation, it was one of the oldest planes flying. It all started in Toulouse, France, on March 2nd, 1969.
Cruise rotation continuing. Nose come up to 20 degrees. She's airborne. She flies.
Concorde was the child of a political marriage between France and Britain to build the passenger jet of the future. "16 airlines around the world signed options to buy Concorde. The future of the aircraft looked bright. Its creators were convinced that by the year 2000, it would be the best-selling airplane in the world. But the dream of an international fleet of supersonic jets never became a reality. When the price of fuel began to soar in the 1970s, most of the airlines lost interest in the sleek gas guzzler. Only 14 Concordes ever went into service. High above the Atlantic Ocean at over 1,000 miles per hour. Although the outside air temperature is freezing, the outer surface of the plane is boiling hot.
The temperature of the hull is actually 109 degrees Celsius or 228 degrees Fahrenheit. At 50,000 feet, the aircraft stretches by 6 inches. You can now shove a hand in this gap between two panels, and after landing, the gap will be closed.
Tout à l'heure à l'atterrissage, les deux parois vont se rejoindre.
Paris to New York in less than 4 hours. Thanks to the 6-hour time difference between these two cities, Concorde was able to beat the clock. It arrived earlier than it departed. As the French Concorde lands in New York, its British sister plane takes off for London.
Folks who work at the airport, who are the most hardened airport professionals, still turn around and stop and take a look when it lands or takes off. It creates that sense of wonder. Still, Kennedy Airport operates all of the biggest aircraft and different types of aircraft in the world, but when the Concorde takes off or arrives, people stop and turn around.
C'est un avion qui a très souvent
This airplane always flies at the limit. Speed, temperature, everything is always at the limit, at the edge, which means you're always just about to make a mistake.
Presque à la limite pour faire une erreur.
On July 25, 2000, the limit was breached. A Concorde literally dropped from the sky and burst into a deadly fireball.
I was in my office, the windows were open, and I heard a terrible noise. I saw the Concorde coming right at me, its engines on fire. I was on the phone and screamed, "The Concorde is falling on my head." I dropped the phone and ran. I had just made it to my door, and then there was a massive explosion.
For Patrick, 60 feet meant the difference between life and death. The building right next to him was completely destroyed. 100 passengers, 9 crew members, and 4 people on the ground lost their lives. Nobody was closer to the plane's crew than Jules Laugelin, the air traffic controller. He cleared the crew to leave and was the last one to speak to them. Flight 4590 was already 2 hours late. The passengers, most of them German, had to connect with a cruise liner in New York.
I gave him the clearance for takeoff, and as it is a very nice plane that I like very much, I was watching the plane getting on the power on the runway. Suddenly I saw a flame behind the aircraft, and this happened in a few seconds after the initial clearance for takeoff. As soon as I saw this flame, I opened the mic to inform the captain that there was a fire going on behind the plane. The pilot just answered me, "Roger." I knew that the situation was critical after maybe 2 seconds.
On a nearby highway, the wife of a truck driver just happened to be filming the airport. Her startling images captured the horror of the doomed flight.
And then I heard a voice on the radio that told me, "That's it. The aircraft is on the carpet." which in French says, "Ça y est, il est au tapis." It means that it's over. I saw this big amount of smoke a few kilometers away, and I understood that the crash was there and that the impossible had happened.
With over 20 years of service, the Concorde had never crashed, but in a matter of seconds, its impeccable safety record was shattered forever.
Through the link that I had with this crew, I feel that I was with them, so now, after the accident, sometimes I felt that I was a kind of survivor, or maybe the only one that survived this crash.
After the crash, Gilles couldn't bear to continue his work at the Paris airport. One of the victims was the German-born Brigitte Kruse, a member of the flight crew. Brigitte Kruse had been a flight attendant on Concorde for 13 years.
It's up to you. Would you take it? Of course I can.
She was proud to work on a plane known for its legendary luxury service to the rich and famous. Being part of this elite team in Air France meant everything to her.
It's a wonderful plane, and I think every stewardess on Air France is dreaming once to work on a Concorde. It's such a different plane, and perhaps one day we won't have a supersonic plane anymore.
Brigitte's parents got a phone call from her every time she boarded the plane. This time, they received a second call.
I turn the TV on, and I see the Concorde burning at the rear and crashing to the ground. Then the telephone rings. Some airline official on the other end of the line. Are you Mr. Kruse? Yes. Is your daughter on Concorde today? I say yes. He says I'll get back to you in 15 minutes. And after a quarter of an hour, the phone goes again. I take the call, and then he says, I have sad news for you. There are no survivors.
Immediately after the crash, the entire Concorde fleet was grounded. News leaked to the press that there had been more than 40 safety-related incidents in recent years. French investigators found this 16-inch sharp piece of metal in the middle of the runway. It had fallen off the Continental Airlines plane that took off 5 minutes earlier. This tiny scrap would later become the most controversial piece of evidence in the ensuing debate on the cause of the crash. While traveling down the runway, one of the Concorde tires hit the strip of metal and was ripped apart. Heavy chunks of rubber then punctured the fuel tank in the left wing. Kerosene poured out and burst into flames. The plane had already reached the point of no return, known as V1. At this speed, it is impossible to abort the takeoff. The pilot heaved the plane into the air and guided it over the highway. But he quickly lost the struggle to control it. After just 1 minute in the air, Concorde crashed into a hotel. According to the French government officials, the strip of metal caused the accident. But because Air France is also government-owned and the national carrier of France, this conclusion was called into question. At the French news magazine Le Point, several reporters began inquiries of their own, but nobody at the airport was allowed to talk to them. Even the names of the eyewitnesses were kept secret.
We got in touch with Air France personnel, from the ground crew to the flight personnel, including pilots and flight attendants. None of them would answer any questions. It looks like a cover-up, as if they were under orders not to talk.
The secrecy surrounding the crash gave rise to suspicions that the whole truth was not being told.
In my opinion, neither Air France nor the investigation authority really know what happened. Too many issues of politics or economics were at stake. And all the more since Air France was close to privatization. They wanted to close the files on this affair as soon as possible.
The legal battle took place in London. Continental Airlines seemed to be liable, and the victims' families were fighting for the highest possible settlement.
The situation was very tense. It didn't look like an out-of-court settlement could be reached. There was a very high risk that we would have to fight through a lawsuit in an American court.
A lawsuit in the United States is one thing every European insurance company wants to avoid. U.S. courts tend to award much higher settlements than those in Europe. Although Continental Airlines was officially responsible for the crash, they did not have to cover the entire sum. Air France had to pay its share as well. The lawyers worked around the clock. A settlement was reached within a few months.
It is less than could have been payable had matters gone forward to a full conclusion in the United States. It is a compromise. We call it mid-Atlantic.
We have an agreement for a sum of money which will be paid to each claimant. They are going to get their money subject to the satisfaction of a number of conditions.
Remember, we had a phase.
Damages of up to $8 million per victim were paid in exchange for a waiver on any further claims. All of the victims' families accepted the settlement, even before the final investigation report was completed. Jörg Meyer lost both his parents in the crash. Like all the others, he signed away the right for any further investigation. He would like to know more, but now it's too late.
The question of guilt was left aside for a long time. I think that this question will be raised one day. And if you know of all the security measures that could perhaps have prevented the accident, probably the disaster wouldn't have happened. And that really bothers me. It makes me angry. In the end, the question of guilt must be addressed.
As the investigation got underway, access to the wreckage remained highly restricted. The black box flight data and cockpit voice recorders were both found.
We went to make a turn on the side crash, and I found 2 flight recorders on the ground outside the hotel. So the gendarmerie came and put the seals on the flight recorders, and around 11 o'clock in the night we went in the BEA and we start to perform the readout of the flight recorders.
The recovery of the black box and the cockpit voice recorder raised hopes that the cause of the crash would be revealed. After filtering out the noise with a computer, the recordings give a chilling account of the last seconds of the flight. The data from the flight recorders seem to confirm the initial crash theory. The Concorde caught fire at a point when it was moving too fast to abort the takeoff, but too slow for stable flight. A year and a half after the crash, the final investigation report was published. By now, all the families had received their settlements and the case was closed. The report concluded that a simple strip of metal had brought this technological wonder down. The metal had fallen off the engine of the Continental Airlines flight during takeoff.
To understand this accident and to understand the fire, you have to understand the different steps of the accident. The first one is the damage to the tire by a strip of metal on the runway. The second one is the blocks of tire, heavy blocks of tire, hitting the wing, which is also a tank.
The official report was nearly 400 pages long and offered an exhaustive collection of data. However, a number of serious technical errors revealed in the report were completely disregarded in the final conclusion.
Personally, I flew Concorde several times, but since the crash, I wouldn't do it again, even for free. I am scared, justified or not. As long as they do not answer the questions on this crash, you have to be skeptical.
The supersonic airliner was grounded for more than a year. In order to get its license back, Air France and British Airways undertook the biggest ever overhaul of their Concorde fleet. Kevlar panels were inserted into the fuel tanks to make them safe. New tires were produced that would shred into harmless small pieces in case of an accident. The two airlines were ready to pay whatever it took to keep Concorde going. Altogether, they spent $150 million on the safety modifications. On November 7, 2001, the new Concorde was back on the runway. The airlines were desperate to put the accident behind them and look towards the future.
Hello, I need a number in Paris, please.
But the journalist David Rose was not convinced that even these improvements would have prevented the tragedy. The results of his research contradicted the official explanation.
The crash was avoidable. That even if the plane had hit the piece of metal on the runway, if the tire had burst and the fire started and the engines began to fail, if the other mistakes had not been made, this plane could, in all probability, have been landed safely.
Rose's conclusions focused the blame on Air France. He questioned their role in the investigation.
What you have here is a government which is trying to protect its interests and is very keen that the world does not believe that that government's companies made important mistakes. But in fact, I think the more you look into this, there are very serious errors that have been made by the Air France maintenance department and then by the pilot on the day of the crash.
According to Rose, the problems began during the final check of the landing gear.
This is an astonishing piece of negligence. They simply leave out this vital component.
A crucial piece of the undercarriage was missing on the doomed flight, the so-called spacer inside the landing gear. Its job is to keep the wheels in proper alignment. When the spacer is missing, the wheels can slip, causing the plane to drift away from the runway centerline.
I've spoken to quite a number of air crew and ground crew on both sides of the English Channel. Some of them are still working for the airlines, some of them have left and can speak on the record. Concorde personnel, all of them agree with the conclusions of my report.
Rose is convinced that the crash was the result of human error and could have been prevented. John Hutchinson agrees with Rose. He was a British Airways Concorde pilot for 15 years.
The fact that the spacer was missing in the left-hand undercarriage was actually identified by one of the team of British Airways ground engineers who'd gone out to help at the crash site. And he drew the attention of the French authorities to this missing spacer, and then subsequently that missing spacer was found in a hangar.
Hutchinson believes that sheer carelessness during maintenance in Paris might have put the lives of the passengers and crew in danger from the very beginning. A photograph taken immediately after the crash reveals that the ill-fated Concorde did not head straight down the runway. With no spacer to stabilize them, the left front wheels started to wobble like the wheels of a shopping cart. The Concorde was in serious trouble well before it hit the strip of metal.
I think the unbalance that was caused by that tire deflating, combined with the spacer being missing, was very significant. And I think that led to the wheels skewing around and dragging the airplane off the side of the runway.
Due to its shape, the Concorde required a higher speed for takeoff than a 747. Like any other airplane, it had to accelerate in a completely straight line. The doomed Concorde, however, drifted to the left early on.
You can see from that picture very clearly that the airplane has been dragged off the side of the runway. Literally, that's the hard shoulder of the runway. And that then led, of course, to the captain lifting the airplane into the air at too slow a speed, because he could see himself going off the side of the runway, and no pilot wants to go across the grass at very high speed like that.
Ian Kirby has a record of over 8,000 flying hours on Concorde as a flight engineer. He understands why the French captain took off too early.
I suspect that was in his mind. Heading for the grass, rotate, get airborne, we'll sort the problem out when we're airborne. Obviously at that stage, although they knew there was a fire reported by air traffic control, they had no idea just how severe that fire was.
For the English Concorde experts, the missing spacer was just the first of many severe errors. 2 tons of fuel had been pumped into the tanks just to get the plane to the runway. This was twice as much as was actually needed, and left the plane with an extra ton of fuel on board. Furthermore, Concorde's luggage compartment had been overloaded. 19 extra suitcases were stuffed into the rear hold just before takeoff. The plane's center of gravity had now dangerously shifted to the rear.
So there were 1,200 kilos of fuel in that tank number 11 at the beginning of the takeoff that shouldn't have been there. plus the weight from those bags, though you're talking about 1.2 tons of fuel and, say, 0.6 of a ton of baggage that really wasn't in the calculations at all for takeoff, a total of about 1.8 tons over the maximum takeoff weight.
Another serious mistake was the choice of the runway. When the tower advised of a strong tailwind, the pilot did not react.
The airplane, instead of taking off against the wind, into the wind, was taking off with the wind coming from behind the airplane. And that's okay, you know, you can do that, but you have to compensate for a tailwind by reducing the weight of the airplane.
According to John Hutchinson, this tailwind increased the effect of the extra weight by as much as 3 times.
Basically, it means that the airplane would have accelerated down the runway more slowly because it was heavier than it should have been. It would also have had to have got to a higher speed on the ground because of a tailwind before it was able to lift off. So, you know, it was really, everything was working against the crew.
With the missing spacer, excess weight, and a strong tailwind, Flight 4590 had 3 strikes against it even before it left the gate.
The correct speed for rotation on that flight was 198 knots, and he lifted the airplane into the air at something like 183, 184 knots, about 15 knots or thereabouts below the correct speed. That then meant that the airplane was staggering into the air at far too slow a speed, far too high a nose-up angle, far too much drag caused by that.
A fourth mistake made the crash all but inevitable. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that the flight engineer had turned off the burning engine without asking permission from the captain.
Number 2 engine, which was having a fire warning at the time, was shut down. That occurred 20 knots below the minimum speed at which it is safe to shut an engine down. At that stage, I think it was impossible to fly that aeroplane out of that situation, and therefore impact with the ground was going to be inevitable.
Finally, there was a loss of control caused by either the ferocity of the fire burning through the flying controls and burning through the hydraulic pipes that power those flying controls, or by virtue of the fact that the centre of gravity went very rapidly rearwards as that fuel all came out of that tank.
Very few air crashes are caused by a single incident. On this occasion, a combination of mistakes and misfortune pushed the plane beyond its limits. The French Investigation Authority, BEA, rejected this explanation. Although all of these errors were documented in their report, they were completely ignored in the final conclusion.
We have studied every detail, every fact, and we kept some of them as contributing to the accident, and others were not contributing factors.
I think that final report basically glossed over the realities that led to the crash. It was, if you like, being slightly economical with the truth.
The final report also did not mention that the disaster could have been even worse. As the burning Concorde took off, it nearly crashed into an Air France 747 with French President Jacques Chirac on board. Several eyewitnesses confirmed that both planes came dangerously close to each other as Concorde drifted to the left. From the rear window of the 747, a tourist took 3 photographs that captured the early moments of the drama.
The loss of an icon like Concorde was a catastrophe beyond all imagination. The prospect or the thought that it might have been an even worse catastrophe by involving this 747 that had come in from Tokyo and crashing with that and perhaps killing people on that 747. I think that would have been such a terrible, traumatic shock to the corporate culture of Air France that they would quite reasonably not want to talk about it.
Many Air France employees saw the crash while on duty at the airport, but they were forbidden by the company to discuss it publicly. Air France had one official voice and one official version of what happened.
This accident has touched all the employees of Air France because of the enormous human loss and because of our professional pride. Air France has always had a policy of openness, but I believe we have to preserve the quality of the investigation and avoid speaking with too many voices.
But some French aviation experts have also been critical of the official investigation. 2 former Concorde crew members go even further than their English colleagues. Jean-Marie Chauve was a Concorde captain for 5 years and a Concorde instructor for 4 years. Michel Sio has 15 years' experience as a flight engineer on Concorde.
Cette fameuse lamelle
Everybody speaks about that famous strip of metal. We think that the tire number 2 burst before it hit the strip of metal.
The key to the mystery lies in the first 10 seconds of takeoff. Chauve and Sio agree with the English on the role of human error, but they don't agree on the importance of the strip of metal. They set out to prove that something else caused the tire to burst.
This is the place where the Concorde began its takeoff. Already at this point, it had drifted off course. The plane was lost long before it hit the strip of metal. It was a lack of thrust, and I think several people know it, including some at the BEA investigation office.
The testimony of the 3 airport firemen was key to determining exactly when the tire burst and the plane caught fire. The firemen were the closest to the runway and the first to see the smoke. All 3 gave identical accounts of what they saw.
If the firemen are to be believed, you can see how they confirm our calculations. From the very beginning, there was a lack of thrust and a drift towards the left.
Chauve and Sio illustrate the distance between the position of the firemen and the point where the metal strip was found. The distance between the 2 points was 2,700 feet.
At 3,000 feet from the start of the runway, one of the firemen sees thick black smoke with a heavy smell, as if a truck tire had burst. And here, far to the right, at 5,700 feet, they found the strip of metal.
Eyewitnesses high up in the control tower were 3 times as far away from the runway as the firemen. 10 seconds after the firemen saw the smoke, they rushed to the runway. But their version of what happened did not match the official record.
What was told by those firemen was irrelevant considering the rest of the fact which we worked on, both on the runway itself, from other observers, or on board the plane. We have no indication at all that what they saw was actually a fact.
The identical accounts of the 3 closest witnesses were considered subjective and insignificant. But what they said confirms Chauve and Sio's theory of when the tire burst. They believe that the pilot must have known that his plane was overweight because he requested the longest possible runway. This included an extension in poor condition and an increased risk of tire damage.
Le Concorde arrive ici.
The Concorde arrives here. It is cleared for takeoff and takes off. All this yellow part is the section of the runway that is in bad condition. The friction caused by the poor surface made the aircraft lose speed.
This is 26 Romeo, the runway where Concorde 4590 took off. After the doomed flight, the runway was repaired. Requests by Chauve and Sio to get the information on the pre-crash condition were denied.
They don't talk. For many questions, there are no answers. Our national carrier simply sticks to the official report and blames the strip of metal. Nobody wants to go any further.
We need to maintain the quality of the investigation. Only authorized personnel may discuss the technical aspects, and that's the investigation office.
All that's left from Concorde 4590 is kept under heavy guard. The famous strip of metal from the continental plane is locked away in a vault at French police. Even British experts who had the right to investigate under the joint French-British Concorde Treaty complained about the atmosphere of secrecy.
In the report, the British Air Accident Investigation Branch comment that they did not have the access they wanted, both to the site, to the items that were recovered, to the recordings from the flight recorder, that's the flight data recorder, from the cockpit voice recorder. It was very much a one-sided thing.
The Paris crash in July 2000 marked the beginning of the end for both the Air France and British Airways Concorde fleets. After its impeccable safety record was shattered, passenger numbers never fully recovered. The steep operating costs finally caught up with her.
We estimate Concorde consumes about 5 times as much labour per hour of flying than a subsonic aircraft. And it is really just due to the unique nature of the aircraft.
These extraordinary planes needed such special care that nearly 200 people were required to keep only 5 British Airways Concordes in service. Some spare parts even had to be custom made.
Costs were escalating, revenue was decreasing, and of course the two lines crossed. And I guess that was the point, that the industry as a whole got together and collectively made the decision that now is the right time. On a personal level, of course I'm disappointed.
Retirement for the plane also meant retirement for its crew, a group that had been considered the elite of the skies for 27 years. 3 years after the Paris accident, it became clear that all the efforts to save Concorde had failed. Ironically, the last months of Concorde were its most profitable. When the retirement of the beloved plane was announced, people felt it was the end of an era and flocked to fill its final flights.